Hello everyone, welcome to a new episode of GeoSpace.
I'm your host, Mohammed Salih, and I'm glad you are joining us for the New Regions bi-weekly podcast, where we unpack the shifting landscape of Middle Eastern geopolitics. Today's episode focuses on Syria, the mounting tensions between the Kurds and the Syrian government under President Mohammed A, and the potential scenarios emerging from this confrontation and what they could mean for the country's broader political transition that has started since the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime in December last year. Syria recently held elections for a 210-member parliament in a process widely criticized and rejected by the representatives of Syrian minority communities for being exclusionary and unfair. Meanwhile, renewed clashes have erupted on the Aleppo front between the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces and the Syrian government troops. There have been also some clashes in the Raqqa province. To help us break this down, I'm joined by Wladimir van Wilgenburg, an expert on Syrian-Kurdish affairs, and Kurdish affairs more broadly, who has closely followed the recent developments in Syria's northeast and the country's majority region of Rojava since the very start of the Syrian revolution in 2011. He is the co-author of The Kurds of Northern Syria: Governance, Diversity and Conflicts with Harriet Alsop, published by IB Tauris in London, and another book, Accidental Allies: The U.S.-Syrian Democratic Forces Partnership Against the Islamic State, with Michael Knights, published by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Before we dive in, a quick reminder that you can find GeoSpace on the New Regions website under the Watch section, as well as on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also explore more of our coverage on Syria at thenewregion.com. Wladimir, it's a real pleasure to have you on GeoSpace. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, my friend.
Absolutely. So before we jump straight to the situation in the northeast or Rojava, let's talk a little bit about the elections that were held recently in early October. It was a highly controversial move that, among numerous other flaws and shortcomings, excluded two critical parts of Syria, the SDF, or the Syrian Democratic Forces, held territory, which is roughly 1/3 of the country's territory, and the Druze majority Sueda province in the south. How are these elections going to affect Damascus's relations with the Kurds and other minorities in general, including the Druze and the Alawites?
Well, the elections, if you compare it, for instance, to the elections in Iraq, they were quite of a weird form of elections because I think it was around 1/3 of the seats was basically pre-selected by the Syrian government. And then the rest, they were sort of independent. So there were not really political parties running on the electoral ballot. So it was not like, for instance, in the elections in Iraq, that you have the Sunnis and the Shia and the Kurds, and they all have their political parties there and they're participating. So that was already one fact that was quite of strange if you compare it, for instance, to the elections in Iraq or for instance, in Turkey. And then apart from that, there were like a small number, like there were, for instance, in Afrin, there were 3 Kurds that were elected. But in general, the areas under control of the SDF, they were excluded. And in general, also, as you mentioned, the Druze areas under Druze control were also excluded in Sueda. So in general, it's like it creates a lot of distrust between Damascus and the northeast because they were just simply excluded from the electoral process. And one of the reasons for that is because this March 12 agreement is still not implemented that they had in March between the SDF and the Syrian interim president, Ahmed al-Shara. We should call him the interim president, not just the president, because it's supposed to be his position is supposed to be interim president.
Right. One thing that really stood out about these elections was that, it wasn't elections, just as you pointed out, in the sense that some other countries in the region, or even Syria under Assad used to do, right? As incredible or, non-credible as those elections might have been. But with these elections, you had 7,000 pre-selected electoral college members were basically selected by those in charge, Ahmed al-Shara's government, that is, and there were also 1,500 pre-selected candidates, again selected by the government. So basically, the situation was such that both the voters and the candidates were essentially picked by the government in advance. Do you think, this would in any way, shape, or form bring about some sort of representative governance in Syria? It's also very interesting that the word democracy is being deliberately avoided, the mention of the word democracy by those in power today in Syria. And they really go into great length to avoid using the term. So, given all this, and given how these elections were designed, like, what are the chances and hopes that some sort of representative government or governance process might emerge in Syria moving forward?
Well, at the moment, it more looks like a selection, not like an election. And the problem also is, as what you mentioned, there's not like an opposition. For instance, in most elections, you have a ruling parties and then you have the opposition parties. But here's not the case. It's not even clear who the opposition is, unless you see the SDF and the Druze armed group as opposition. So I think this election is not very representative of the Syrian population. It looks more like a selection. But I think also the issue is also that there's not really much efforts to form opposition parties. So it's a quite weird situation that Syria is in now, that after the fall of the Assad regime, you basically just have the government controlled by Ahmed al-Shara and basically like his allies from Idlib, the Islamist allies from Idlib. And then you have like a number of independents who are probably also have good relations with the new government. So there's no opposition at all. So that's not like a very good future for Syria if there's no opposition. I mean, even there's not like some form of a fake opposition. There's basically just like a number of independents and you have the Damascus government. So there's not really any form of criticism or anything. So that's not very promising for the future. So we have to see, because until now they still call it the transitional government, interim government. Also, they adapted the constitution. And I think that a lot of these unilateral moves by the new authorities in Damascus made the side of the SDF very worried, because it's all imposed. Like there's not a lot of dialogue. For instance, they had a national dialogue. Also, there were no political parties there. It was like sort of a one-sided dialogue. They selected some people to be part of the dialogue. And that's also, this election looked like this also, that there's a selection of certain people that they already like. They go to the ballot box and the rest is even directly selected by the government. So I think that's a little bit the issue that they now have. And you saw that there was some fighting. Also today there was again some clashes. So the tensions are still ongoing.
Right. We'll get to those tensions and fighting in a moment. But if you recall, there were like efforts or a plan by the SDF affiliated autonomous administration in northeast Syria that basically governed the process of the provinces of Hasaka, Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, parts of Deir ez-Zor, and parts of Aleppo. They had a plan last year to hold elections in their own territory. This was before the fall of the Assad regime. And there was a very major opposition by Syria, which by Turkey, sorry, which also pushed the Americans to not support those elections. So why were those elections not held, and what that means right now for the status of Rojava where those in charge or the administration might be lacking legitimacy arising from elections, and that the government in Damascus might actually use that against them.
Well, I mean, the thing is that I think Turkey was worried that if you have elections in the northeast, that it would give some form of legitimacy to this administration in the northeast. So that's why Turkey was opposed to it, because, for instance, you had that also in Iraqi Kurdistan in the 90s after the Saddam regime withdrew. Immediately, the Iraqi Kurds, they hold elections and then they form the government. Although in northeast Syria, it looked a little bit different. They formed a government and then they start to having elections. Sort of now also what's happening in Damascus, that you have a government and then they are holding elections, but in a bit a different way. So I think that's why Turkey was opposed, and US, they also opposed it because they are afraid it would create more tensions with Turkey, basically. So that's why they are sort of stuck. I mean, at the same time, they say, "Oh, you're not democratic," but also they don't want them to hold an election. So that's a little bit an issue. I think in the beginning they have. I was there in northeast Syria in Rojava when they had one election, but it was just more on the local level. It didn't reach the national level, if you can call it the national level, because it's like a local regional government basically. So I think that's the current situation, is that they were not able to hold their sort of national elections for the northeast.
Right. Let's, I remember those elections, and it was at that time when the Kurdish run or led administration had not really expanded into the territory that it currently has, or came to control as a result of the fight against the Islamic State or ISIS. So it makes sense that they wanted to have elections last year, in the entire territory that they control. But as you also pointed out, those elections did not go ahead and happen. Let's get to the fighting between, the SDF and the Syrian government forces. So we have had clashes between the two sides for the past few weeks. Actually, clashes have been around in some, shape or form since December, since the fall of the Assad regime. Despite multiple ceasefires, the most prominent of which were probably through the March 10th agreement between President Shara and the SDF chief, General Mazloum Abdi. And we also had another ceasefire being announced a couple of days ago by the Syrian defense minister, following talks between a high-level SDF delegation and the Damascus government, with the presence of the U.S. Special Envoy for Syria, Thomas Barak. So why are we seeing, this repeated breakdown of ceasefires and the resumption of fighting, including today, as you mentioned?
There was this agreement in March. They agreed on 12 points, but they never had like a very clearly outlined view on the future, like how the future of Syria should look like. The SDF, they want a decentralized system, and Ahmed al-Shara keeps saying that they don't want to decentralize system or autonomy because it would be a threat not only to Syria, it will divide Syria, and also will be a threat to neighboring countries like Turkey and Iraq. So there's a very different vision, and the SDF always is saying that we don't want to divide Syria. So I think there's a lot of distrust between the both sides, and that's why even though there's this ceasefire that was announced in Damascus after one day of heavy fighting in Aleppo, there are still clashes, and also there's a fact is that you also have these Turkish-backed groups. The SDF have been suggesting that they have maybe not been following orders from Damascus. Damascus, so far, they haven't commented on that. And also today they said Damascus said one of their fighters was killed in a clash, and the SDF also said that they were attacked and one fighter from the Damascus government was killed in the clash. So I think this distrust and the non-implementation of this agreement, it leads to tensions and the constant risk of conflict. And we also saw what happened in Sueda and the coast. Also yesterday there were some clashes again in Sueda. So Sueda is the Druze majority area. So even in Sueda, sort of the situation is similar, although there was a real attempt by Damascus to take Sueda. Well, they haven't been doing that yet in the northeast, although there were some limited clashes in Aleppo, but it was not something like what was going on in Sueda, where actually the Syrian government forces entered the city center. Like something like that has not happened in the northeast.
Right. If you could, maybe elaborate a little bit on the presence of these Turkish-backed or, at least previously pro-Turkish Syrian National Army groups that have been integrated into the, new Syrian Defense Ministry post-Assad. How much is their presence on the borderlines in Aleppo, in Raqqa in particular, is affecting the relationship between the SDF and the Syrian government, given that there is quite a bit of bad blood between the Kurds and these groups, as these groups have committed atrocities in the past against Kurds in places like Afrin. So to what extent is their presence really being a menace to this ceasefire or peace between Damascus and the SDF?
Well, what happened after the fall of the Assad regime is that basically the Syrian government integrated those Turkish-backed groups from the Syrian National Army into the new army, and they basically gave them certain regions. So the thing is that the areas that are bordering between the Syrian government and the SDF, they are all controlled by the commanders of those Turkish-backed groups. So, for instance, in Deir ez-Zor, you have, I think the leader of Ahrar al-Sharqiya is now in command of the Deir ez-Zor front line. And also in Aleppo, you have different Turkish-backed groups that got positions in the new Syrian army. And also the SNA groups, they were not really disbanded. They were basically kept sort of intact, but basically renamed in brigades and such. So that has made it more complicated because those groups are still they're still intact basically, and that you also saw that SDF leaders, they have like criticized these decisions because some of these leaders that have been integrated into the Syrian National Army, they have also been under sanctions from the US for integrating ISIS members in their groups, or also of violations against the Kurdish population, for instance, in Afrin. So they're not really, it's not that they are, for instance, now Damascus is asking the SDF to disband as individual fighters joining the new Syrian army. But at the same time, you have these Turkish-backed groups that basically have like their own brigades or own corps, basically. So they created different units, and they are from the Syrian National Army groups. Basically, they all got their own regions. Basically, for instance, also you have Abu Amsha. He got also his own region. I think he's active he's became basically the commander of the 25th Division, and he's basically active in Hama, for instance. So basically, they have their own brigade structure still intact. And in addition to that, you have the Syrian you have the Syrian Army's general security, and you have so they have basically internal security and defense, which is basically quite similar actually to the SDF system, because the SDF, they also have the SDF as the defense component, and then you have the Asaj or the internal security as the internal component. So yeah, that's a little bit the situation.
Based on what you have been saying so far, I'm sensing there are two distinct but interrelated issues or problems here. One is like a lack of consistency in terms of how the Shara government is approaching the question of integrating different military or armed groups into the new military of Syria. So with the groups that were previously part of the Syrian National Army, the pro-Turkish or the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army, those groups are being allowed to integrate as whole divisions into the structure of the new military, which in a way allowed them to keep their pre-existing command and power structure and bring that into the new Syrian military. But the government in Damascus is not willing to extend the same deal to the SDF to be integrated as a whole, as a force into the new Syrian military, probably in the form of, for example, the regional north or northeast command of the new Syrian army. So that is one problem, the lack of consistency. The other one is the questionable amount of control that the government in Damascus seems to have on or over all these newly integrated divisions, including the former Syrian National Army ones. So given these two real and serious issues that we are seeing, to what extent do you think this would motivate or encourage the SDF to really want to be part of the new Syrian state military and security apparatus?
Well, the SDF also, there were some interviews given by leaders from the Northeast, and they were suggesting that actually Damascus has offered them positions in the new Syrian army or defense ministry, but that they refused because they wanted to have some form of constitutional guarantees. Because until now, apparently, they haven't received any constitutional guarantees. Ahmed Shara have said that he's gonna give rights to the Kurds, but there haven't been much constitutional guarantees, for instance, in the constitution they adopted. So I think the main demand of the SDF side is basically constitutional recognition or some form. And this was also in the past, they also had negotiations with the Assad regime. As you know, before the fall of the Assad regime, there were several negotiations between the Northeast and the Assad regime. And they also always failed because the Assad regime thought, oh, they're going to win the war and eventually everybody's going to accept the Assad regime and normalize their relations with the Assad regime. Was actually before the fall of the regime was actually happening. There were a lot of Gulf Arab states that were actually normalizing their relationship with Assad. And but now the situation completely different. The Assad regime fell and they didn't want to make any concessions. But now it seems sort of going to the same track that you have again. Because, for instance, the Kurdish neighborhoods in Aleppo always saw this distrust. Always there were like tensions there between the central authorities and the Kurds over the Kurdish control over these two neighborhoods, which are now surrounded by areas controlled by the Syrian government. So I think that's why it's like this process is going very slow. And also Ahmed Shara is backed by Turkey, which has a lot of influence in Syria. And also you see that the US, they have changed their position a lot. I mean, before the fall of the Assad regime, the US only worked basically with the Syrian Free Army units in Tanaf and with the SDF. But now basically the US is also active with supporting the government in Damascus basically to recover the economy and to make a more inclusive system. So also Damascus, they feel more empowered because they feel they have the support of the US and from the Trump administration. And you also saw that the US, they have withdrawn some forces and reduced their number of bases in northeast Syria. So that's also made the negotiations more difficult because one side feels empowered over the other. And there's not a lot of move to concessions. And I was also attending a conference in Erbil where they also discussed Syria, and there was one person speaking from the northeast, and she was saying that both Damascus and both the SDF, they have to make some form of concessions, otherwise you will not reach anywhere. And basically this is also very similar to the peace process now, what you have between the PKK and the Turkish state. You had the Kurdistan region president Necip van Barzani talking about that both sides are not making any steps, and that's why it looked a little bit that the process is being slowed down a lot. And with this agreement, it was a bad idea that they put a deadline on it. So the deadline is the end of this year. And then after the deadline, what will happen? Will it be a joint Syrian-Turkish operation against the SDF? Or will there be an extension of the deadline, or what they will do? So I think it's very stuck because of these different visions. Like Damascus want a very centralized system. And even you saw the US envoy previously talking about that a federal system of a decentralized system doesn't work in the region. Although I think he has retracted his comment to a certain extent in his latest interviews. So I think that's why it's very stuck, because Damascus feels empowered, and the SDF doesn't want to just disband and give everything to Damascus. They don't want that. So it's a very difficult discussion. But we also saw in Iraq with the Kurdistan region and Baghdad that even after the fall of the Saddam regime, until now, they have these discussions about basically federalism and autonomy, and that Baghdad is centralizing, not accepting demands from the Kurdistan region. So they have, even in Iraq, you still have the same debate, although the Kurdistan region is recognized by the Iraqi constitution. So even constitutional will not be always the main guarantor for peace between Qamishli and Damascus, to put it.
Right. I think, for context, for our audiences and listeners, it's important to also keep in mind that in the case of Iraq, especially post-2003, the groups that came to dominate Baghdad, the Shia groups and, in general, the non-Kurdish groups, none of them were involved in, massacres or atrocities against the Kurdish people. So the Ba'ath regime, which was, which had committed major atrocities, had been overthrown, and the new groups in charge in Baghdad, at least had a sympathetic view toward the Kurds. They did not have the blood of Kurds on their hands, and so that really facilitated the new arrangement and agreements post 2003. In Baghdad and in Iraq overall. But in the case of Syria, the situation is really different. Before the fall of before December 2024, you had the Assad regime, with which Kurds had a very, bad relationship. It was a highly oppressive regime that criminalized, basically expressions of Kurdish culture, Kurdish political activity, and all of that. And now, as a result of the, uprising, the revolution since 2011, you have had basically, this fighting between some of the groups in charge in Damascus today, such as, the HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham of President al-Shara, and also the Syrian National Army groups, all of which have fought Kurds at some point, with the SNA groups in particular, having this really highly negative image and reputation among Kurds. And I think that also hinders the process of reaching, any sort of really functioning and lasting and workable deal. What are your thoughts on that, Wladimir?
Well, in fact, they didn't only fought with the SNA. In the past, they have also fought with Jabhat al-Nusra, which was the predecessor of HTS. During the Sarakani battle, which was a very heavy battle. And they actually also, at that time, also had fighting and then again agreements to stop the fighting. So it's not something new. They have experience with the people that are now in control of Damascus before, because the predecessor of HTS, they were also present in the areas close to the SDF. But basically with the SNA factions, they have a more recent history, because you had this Turkish operation in 2018, a Turkish operation in 2019, when Turkey allied with these groups basically took those areas from the SDF. So that's why there's a lot of distrust. Also because the same commanders that were basically leading those operations against the SDF, they are now also in charge of large military structures and are basically bordering the northeast. And then also you have these discussions every time that, for instance, when something happens between the SDF and Damascus, then Damascus blames the SDF for attacking them, and the SDF blames Damascus for attacking them. But what also a fact is that before these clashes started, there was like a high-level military meeting between these commanders from some of these Turkish-backed factions and the Aleppo governor. So it seems there was a sort of meeting before these clashes started. So it seems almost like it was sort of planned. And I think sort of the clashes and the pressure that Damascus is basically putting on the SDF, it's an attempt, it's a probing attempt to see where the weak lines are in the defenses of the SDF. And another way, it's also a way to pressure the SDF, basically to send a message: look, if you don't give in to our demands, then we could attack you. And that's why it keeps on going with like some clashes, then it stops again. And I think France and the US, they have been heavily involved in stopping a conflict from breaking out. And now you also have the Kurdish president in Turkey visiting the Turkish leadership. So maybe that's also part of an effort to basically cool down tensions in Syria, and also related to the peace process in neighboring Turkey. So we have to see how this will work out also, because the deadline I mentioned is not very far away. I mean, it's December, it's just a few months away. And also the deadline for the peace process in Turkey is also December. So there's a risk that things could escalate after, if both sides don't make concessions on this issue of centralization and decentralization.
Right. One of the things that we also keep hearing from both, the authorities in Damascus and in Ankara as well, is that, their problem, so to speak, is with the SDF and not with the Kurdish people. We hear the same in Turkey, the Turkish government repeatedly saying that their problem is with the PKK and not with the Kurds there. And we have had the same rhetoric in Iraq, both at the present moment, but especially more so before 2003, where the Iraqi government would say their problem is with what they would call Kurdish saboteurs, which were basically the KDP and the PUK in Iraq at that point, and not the Kurdish people. How does it, this kind of rhetoric seems to be just a rhetorical tactic, really, something very worn out and tested and tried. Do you think that this kind of statement is credible in the sense that Damascus's issue and problem is really with the SDF, and that it has credibility with the rest of the Kurdish population, or the broader general Kurdish population in Syria, those who are not SDF at least?
I mean, there's always this thing in the states where Kurds live, that they always say we don't have a problem with the Kurds, we have a problem with the Kurdish political party. But what they basically have a problem with is that Kurds have any form of self-governance, because they're against decentralization or autonomy or federalism. They don't have a problem if Kurds accept, for instance, centralist state, then they don't have a problem with it. But if the Kurds want to have some form of autonomy or independence or something like that, then it becomes a problem. So actually their problem, in fact, it's that, so you could say that actually they do have a problem with Kurds if they want to have any form of self-governance separate from the centralist state. So I think they do have an issue with a form of Kurdish self-determination. And that's a big issue. And I think from the Damascus point of view, they are afraid of that they say, oh, Syria will be divided and this kind of things. Although you have many federal examples in the world where federalism works, although most also some of those federalist examples are not, for instance, based on ethnic federalism. I mean, you have different models. So it doesn't necessarily mean the breakup of Syria. But I think that's, and also if you look to the Kurdish parties in general, most of the Kurdish parties, they want some form of autonomy or decentralization. Either it's the PYD or it's the Kurdish National Council, which is closer to the Kurdish party here in Iraqi Kurdistan. So I think there's, in general, if you look to the majority of the Kurdish parties, they are more in favor of a form of autonomy or decentralization. It's not just the PYD and the SDF that want that. Actually, in the past, for instance, the Kurdish National Council even have asked for like a sort of Kurdistan region of Syria, basically. So that even goes further than what the SDF want. But I think also one big issue is also that the SDF, they control also Arab majority areas like Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. And there has been also pressure on Damascus, basically from activists from those areas, that they say those areas should return to Damascus because they are not Kurdish majority areas. But then you have, for instance, also Kurdish majority areas like Afrin, which are under the control of Damascus. Although you have also Kurdish parties active in Afrin, but like militarily speaking and governance-wise, like it's under control of Damascus and the Turkish-backed factions. So that's also creates some issues. And also that's why one of the main topics also in the talks between Damascus is about the return of IDPs. So that talks about the focuses on IDPs that were displaced from areas like, for instance, Afrin and Ras Al Ain or Serikania and Tal Abyad. So Tal Abyad not so much because Tal Abyad was an Arab majority area, but Serikania was more mixed between Kurds and Arabs. So it remains a big dispute, and I think this will continue unless there will be some form of a middle ground.
Right. Let's for a moment give the benefit of the doubt to the authorities in Damascus and accept their claim that their problem is with the SDF and not the general Kurdish population in Syria. But the question that really brings up is that given the track record of this new government in Damascus toward the Kurds and the minorities in general in Syria, why should any Kurd anywhere in Syria, really, especially in the SDF-held territories, have any goodwill, any trust in the government in Damascus? The constitutional declaration by Sharia does not recognize or mention Kurds in any shape or form, does not even give any hint of recognizing their culture and granting them, rights that would come from that, including linguistic rights, the use of Kurdish in the public or even private education system. And recently, Sharia put out a decree on the national holidays in Syria, and it did not include the most important day in the Kurdish calendar or the most important Kurdish cultural event in the year, which is Nowruz, or the Kurdish New Year. The government has been also unwilling to hold the election that it did, no matter how flawed it was, in the northeast, under the pretext of security conditions not being conducive to that, which is not correct. Northeast Syria has been actually, probably the safest part of the country since the fall of Assad and before that. And you also, if you look at, Syrian social media, you see a lot of vulgar and crude racism being espoused consistently on the part of people who are, Ahmed al-Shara's supporters or claim to be supporters, people close to him who appear in the media and on the social media. These are known people. Usually have a very hostile and aggressive attitude toward Kurds or any notion of Kurdish rights. Ahmed al-Shara's forces have massacred or tribal forces that he allowed to be mobilized in the case of Suwaida and also the coastal Alawite majority areas. They have been allowed to basically massacre, commit mass atrocities against Druze and Alawite minorities in Syria. Given all of this, why should any average Kurd sitting today in a place like Qamishli or Hasaka, Kobani or Afrin should have any faith or trust in the intent of the Syrian government to grant them any sort of dignified conditions for them to be able to live in Sharia Syria?
Well, I mean, one of these things also it created a lot of distrust is that, first of all, President Ahmed al-Shara didn't change the name of the Syrian Republic. It's still called the Syrian Arab Republic, which is actually strange coming from a man coming from an Islamic political background, like Islamic political party background, that they keep Arab in the title. And then also another thing was that during Sueda, for instance, there were also, if you look to the rhetoric that the pro-Syrian government supporters have towards the Druze, they always say our problem is with Hikmet al-Hijri. It's with him. We have no problem with the Druze because we have these two guys that are supporting us. There's like true Druze leaders that are supporting them. They actually don't have any popular support. And then they say, we don't have any problem with the Druze. But then when the fighting happened, you saw that Druze were killed. They say, are you Druze or are you Muslim? And they were killed. Or you had people, they were shaving off the mustaches of Druze religious members and leaders. And also in the protest, for instance, there was a protest when the Syrian president visited New York. There were supporters of the government and people against the government, mostly from Druze community. Also, like the protesters were making these signs that, the scissors. The scissors became sort of a symbol for pro-Syrian government supporters against that they say they are against Hijri, but they make this sign with the scissors. And until now, we haven't seen any condemnation by the Syrian government saying, no, this kind of symbolism, should not be allowed. This is discriminating against the Druze, that you're suggesting that you want to cut off their mustaches because they are from a different religious component. So I think this kind of messaging is sort of making more distrust, that they basically are trying to looking for military solutions instead of negotiated solutions. And this is making the things worse. And that's why you also saw the rhetoric of SDF leaders changing more drastically after what happened, especially in Sueda. I mean, the Alawites, it was a little bit different in the coast because there was a first attack by Assad regime remnants on the Syrian government forces, and there were many killed. And then the massacre started. But with Sueda, it was different because it was attacking Sueda, and basically there were like a lot of civilians were killed, and there were people kidnapped, and women were kidnapped. So also for Kurds, they also have this thing that, I mean, they still remember what happened to the Yazidis in Sinjar in several years ago, and there are still several missing Yazidi women. And now what you see in with happening to Alawite girls and Druze girls is that a number of them were kidnapped. So they're afraid of this happening again. And there were also news reports that, for instance, a Kurdish girl was kidnapped last month for ransom. So they're afraid of this kind of things of happening again. That's things that, for instance, what happened to the Yazidis in Sinjar could be repeated. What you also saw in Sueda and the coast would be happening to the northeast. So I think that's why also the distrust is growing, and that's why I think the Americans also have a very difficult time to bringing both sides together.
Well, adding to your point, same type of atrocities were also committed against Kurdish females in Afrin, right? Many of whom were abducted, reportedly even forced into prostitution. And so, all of this definitely generates a lot of anxiety, legitimate anxiety based on past record of these groups among the Kurds. Let's get, to the U.S. position on the question of decentralization in Syria. So after the fall of the Assad regime, we saw that the U.S. government gradually adopted this tough line on the question of decentralization and federalism. In a way, also somehow inaccurately posing or framing the situation as being a choice between federalism and full centralization, which was not really ever the case, but it was being interpreted as the U.S. Wanting a centralized Syria, period. And now in the more recent statements by Ambassador Tom Barrack, we are seeing some signs of what might suggest to be a shift in the U.S. position on the question of decentralization, especially after what happened in Sueda. How should we really understand the U.S. position here? Is there any substantial evolution, Or, what are the signs on the ground really telling us beyond the rhetoric on what the US wants to see with regard to the future of Syria, and especially the question of centralization or the lack of it?
Well, I mean, the US in general, like from the beginning of the conflict in Syria, they always said they were for united Syria, sort of like the one Iraq policy they had in Iraq. For instance, also in the beginning, they also wanted they were trying to disband the Peshmerga. And that was also recently mentioned by the Kurdistan region president, Najib Barzani, that the Americans said, okay, we want to rename the Peshmerga in something else. We want to rename it into the National Guard or something. And then said how you would translate National Guard to Kurdish, and then said, well, we just translate it to Peshmerga. So basically the Kurds, they held their ground in Iraqi Kurdistan. And that's actually also, there were a lot of references to that, like the tough talks that Paul Bremer had with President Massoud Barzani in the past. So I think that's sort of also what you have in the Northeast now. You have sort of this negotiation about what are the red lines. And also the US from the beginning, they always said we are not in favor of autonomous area or something like that. Even before, I remember in 2012 and 2013, there was like a small statement by the State Department. Also, I think when they were talking about, there was this idea of having sanction relief on Northeast Syria and Northwest Syria during the Assad regime, because at that time, all of Syria was suffering under the sanctions that were put on the Assad regime, were also affecting the areas that were actually liberated from the Assad regime. So at that time also there was a State Department press briefing, and one of the US officials said, and I don't know which year this was, it was like 2018 or 19, and one of the US officials said, we are not in favor of creating an autonomous zone or something like that. So the US had this policy of saying like, oh, we are only there for anti-ISIS, we're only against terrorism. And we're not there to create like an autonomous region. But of course, I mean, what we also have seen in Iraqi Kurdistan and Iraq is that sort of these de facto realities, they impose themselves on the fact. So you can pretend that there's a one Syria policy, there's a one Iraq policy. But when it's come to the reality on who controls the facts on the ground, things can change through that. So that's why I think also for Damascus, it's difficult if they don't get, for instance, support from Turkey to make this kind of changes on the facts on the ground. So if also, I mean, there's also different scenarios that could happen in Syria, but one of the scenarios could also be is that we're going to be ending up in a scenario what we had in the past. So during the Assad regime, you had, for instance, the area under Turkish control, out of Damascus control. You had the SDF areas out of control. And it was sort of like, how they call it, like a sort of frozen conflict. So we could have something similar now with, for instance, the SDF held areas in Sweden, Damascus not controlling those areas, and those areas de facto remaining autonomous, but having difficulties with humanitarian aid and support and borders. So I think that's also, I mean, the US can have this policy of one Syria, but sometimes the realities force the Americans to change their positions. And maybe this is also one of the reasons why the SDF is not making so many concessions from the beginning, because they know if they just make concessions, they end up with nothing. And recently there also was an article written in the Washington Institute, and the authors were also suggesting the SDF should make this and these concessions, but there were not, for instance, like a demand for concessions from Damascus. So that's why I think these negotiations are going so tough, because the SDF, they don't want to immediately start with concessions, because then you are seen as the weak link in the chain. So that's why if both sides don't make concessions, then it's going to be very difficult to move forward. And I think there are also in northeast Syria, there's also ways to make progress. I mean, if there's any form of a constitutional recognition of a form of decentralization, that they have some local form of government, and having, for instance, the Arab majority areas returning to, it could, I mean, there's easy solutions that could be made, I think.
Right. Very briefly, Turkey's name keeps coming up in the discussion on Syria and the relationship between President Shara's government and the Kurds. To what extent the tough stance that we are seeing from Damascus is really generated by Turkey, or is it, that the case that Damascus also happens to share the same view in terms of how to deal with the Kurds and the Kurdish question, but at some point or sometime they, tend to claim, at least in private, that it is Turkey that is forcing them to take these tough stances?
Well, I mean, the thing is that I think that the view of Damascus and Ankara is quite similar, that both of them are against decentralization. So I think that in that regard, it's not very much different. I mean, the rhetoric that we have seen from Ahmed Ashara on decentralization and federalism is not much different from Turkey. So I think in that regard, it's not a big difference.
Let me ask you this final question. What lessons do you think Syrians, including Shara and his Sunni Arab supporters, have possibly learned from the experience of the past century in terms of how the state of Syria has treated its own Kurds and other minority groups? And, they also went through this extremely gruesome and terrible experience with the Assad regime for the past 14, 15 years. What kind of lessons do you think they might have learned in terms of how to deal with the Kurds in a more humane way, especially those in power who claim to represent the interests of the majority community in Syria?
Well, Ahmed Shara's brother used to live in Erbil in the Kurdistan region. So maybe he could see from that example, maybe he can see from his brother's example how basically it works in, for instance, in neighboring Iraq. So it's not really a threat to the Iraqi state. It can be working. It can work basically. So he also sort of had an autonomous zone in Idlib before, like it was also sort of an autonomous zone surrounded by the Assad regime. So at that time, it was sort of similar that they were running their own affairs, and the Northeast was sort of the same. So I think that could provide a solution, or they could provide like some insight into how to find a solution. But in general, it's probably going to be difficult, because you had that also in Iraqi Kurdistan when the Iraqi Kurds were hosting Shia leaders in Iraqi Kurdistan as opposition against the Saddam regime, and when they returned to Baghdad, they returned back to the centralist practices.
Right. Well, that brings us to the end of today's conversation. Wladimir, it's been a real pleasure having you on the show and hearing your thoughtful insights on Syria and the evolving dynamics in the Northeast. Wladimir van Wilgenburg is a leading analyst of Syrian Kurdish affairs and the co-author of the Kurds of Northern Syria and Accidental Allies, the U.S. Syrian Democratic Forces Partnership Against the Islamic State. And to our listeners, thank you as always for tuning in. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of GeoSpace.